Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally, reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for another week. I'm really glad that you have stuck it out with me this year. I can't believe it's already December. Where has the time gone? Anyway, here we are. Another episode, another week. Just a reminder, I'm not going to have an episode the last 2 weeks of December. It's going to be like a little winter break. And hopefully it will encourage all of you to take breaks from the things that you are investing a ton of time in also. And I'm definitely a little nervous to take the break. I never thought that I would. I thought I would keep going. I didn't even take a break when I got married. I just kind of scheduled the episodes. But I feel like based on all of the really big podcasts out there taking breaks, I feel like I can also, and it's okay. So, of course, needless to say, we will start right back up the first week of January. New year, new you, new me, new everything. And, you can expect all the same good stuff like you had this year and the previous years. So, that's the housekeeping, I suppose. The other thing is I want to remind you that you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast, wherever you're watching. If you went through your Spotify Wrapped and you saw that this podcast was one of your top podcasts, I would love if you would send that graphic to me, if you would share it with me, because it means so much. Some of you have already sent that, and I really appreciate it. And if you give me the okay to post it on Instagram, I will. Otherwise, I will just enjoy the moment. The podcast has... and it's not even miraculous. I think, I put a lot of work into this, so I'm glad that it's received a lot of accolades, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Actually, it was in the top 5% for podcasts shared globally, which, thank you. I have literally no words. It's just been really, really cool to see the analytics over the year or, looking at the past year and to kind of just reflect on the last couple of years doing this. So thank you so much. And I shared this on Instagram also, but I really just want to say thank you to all of you who listen, subscribe, follow, et cetera, et cetera. Even if it's not week to week, if you just kind of tune into the episodes that interest you, either way, I really appreciate it because your time is valuable and you're spending some of your time with me, and that is not lost on me. So while we're on the topic of time, I read an interesting article today, and I just figured, why not talk about this? Because actually it made me think about something that I have been reflecting on in the last, maybe 2 years, really, because I obviously have had a lot to reflect on since managing things through COVID and things like that and changing jobs. But really, my point here is that as HR professionals, we do not have a lot of time and we run pretty lean. And so this article is in the Financial Times, and unfortunately I can't, I guess I was only able to read it once because now I'm limited behind a pay barrier because I don't have a subscription, but I will find a link that lets you read it and reread it. I'm sure it's somewhere. But basically the article goes into this discussion around how HR needs to go back to the basics, and that getting the basics like recruitment, engagement, and things like that, getting those things right and spending less time on perks and mindfulness sessions, as the article went in to describe, could be a better way to spend time. And it's not to say that I agree or disagree, but I do think that there's something to discuss here. When we as HR professionals invest our time in anything, I would hope and imagine that we are investing our time to make a sustainable impact. And I've talked about this recently with someone in my inner circle, basically, that, when we do something and we invest our time, We should be investing our time for like the long term. Now, of course, there are certain things that we do that are more short term adjacent that are, going to really contribute to this like small win in the moment, potentially not something that will carry on for months, weeks, years. But the goal is to spend time and invest time into things that are really going to have a long-term impact, because otherwise it's kind of like you're wasting time. So in my role in employee engagement, I think about this in the sense that I do think that when we focus on things that drive engagement, it is a long-term focus. However, sometimes the things that we're doing to drive engagement are short-term. And I say this because I want to set the stage here. HR people, you, me, our friends, regardless of our titles, whether we're employee engagement, head of people, payroll, HRIS manager, our number one responsibility is to provide a resource for people, right? For humans. And on top of that, our number two or adjacent to number one priority is to drive things that people need, want, are engaged by, appreciate, et cetera, right? So if you're instituting a new HRIS system and it's not solving a problem, or it's not going to be user-friendly for the population that you serve, what are you doing, right? So I say this because I think that there is a misconception that when you are in a specialty within HR, like we could take my role as an example, focused on, director of employee engagement, that is not inclusive of more quote unquote traditional HR processes, which is not true. Because actually those traditional HR processes, as I've kind of just set the stage for us to talk about, can intrinsically and in the long run drive employee engagement. And I think I've been thinking about this a little bit because I have definitely engaged in conversations with people to try and help them understand even my background, and that I'm not just, someone who's really passionate about employee engagement, even though I am, but that I also have this other, well-developed traditional HR practitioner background. And I think that many of us in HR end up specializing at some level. If it's payroll, if it's operations, if it's total rewards or benefits, right? Sometimes we find ourselves in those specialties. But the best thing that we can do while in those specialties is remember that at the end of the day, we are still responsible for looking at things holistically, looking at what we do as HR people as inherently and intrinsically needing to provide people good and helpful resources that therein drive engagement. So hopefully you can see what I'm getting at here, which is that regardless of the role that we're in, we have to see things more broadly. And that is actually the only way to implement strategies actually that will work in the long term. If we're only implementing strategies based on what suits us in our role, in our specialty, we're not necessarily looking cross-functionally, and we're not necessarily looking in the long run. So that's like the first thing I kind of wanted to remind all of us as we think about the, this concept and idea of getting back to basics. What are the basics? We should be doing the basics every single day. Like, I'm not immune to a recruiting process just because I don't own recruiting. That recruitment process has just as much of an impact on employee engagement as a benefit or a perk that I'm planning to roll out in 2023. And for those of you who are HR admins or starting out your HR careers, HR generalists, HR assistants, the same goes for you, right? Like, just because you are kind of getting your feet wet and your hands dirty and getting the experience doesn't mean that you are not capable or responsible for seeing the work that you're doing on a bigger scale and putting it into the big picture. I have, throughout my career, had the opportunity to mentor newer or younger HR professionals. And when I say newer or younger, I'm not referring to age, I'm referring to experience. So in that, the same kind of trend takes place, which is that, or I should say not even trend, the same kind of like common denominator is seen there, which is this like application of thought and strategy, or even projects and tasks, if we're not yet strategic, that application on a small scale without kind of zooming out and looking into the big picture. And as a mentor, I see it as my responsibility, but also this is something that I just always do. I try to help remind that individual that there is a whole bigger picture here to work our projects and tasks into. So at a very basic level, let's say you're an HR administrator and you're supporting with onboarding new employees. How do we look at that process holistically so that the things that we're doing that are like quote unquote HR basics, as this article refers to, like recruitment, engagement, whatever, that those things are just as important as compensation and benefits and job leveling, right? So two totally different spectrums of strategy and responsibility, but they hold the same weight in terms of the impact on the organization. So as you start to mull this over in your brain, if I haven't lost you yet, because I think this is like a lot of theorizing for a morning, but as you mull that over, think about your own role and places where you could kind of zoom out and look at the big picture. If you've ever received feedback from another business leader that, you know, they don't agree with your approach, or, you know, they want to do things differently, sometimes the underlying message there is that it doesn't fit into their big picture, right? So I think sometimes this practice actually helps to improve relationships too, and to build trust, because if you demonstrate looking at the big picture and how your involvement impacts the big picture and the organization on the whole, rather than one person or one department, then there is much more credibility built there. And you're also, you know, kind of demonstrating your ability to see things beyond the scope of your role and in that moment. So coming back to this, again, this concept of getting to the basics, I don't totally disagree. I think when I look back on what COVID did, which was like kind of paint this picture of the necessity behind HR functions, right? Totally appreciate it. If you go back a few hundred episodes potentially, or maybe 50 or so episodes, you'll hear me talk about this a lot, that it's a great thing that there was a huge shift in the workplace and the workforce, which therefore like enabled or further enabled this need and demand for HR people, which is great. But I think part of that is that there was a huge shift in focusing on burnout, employee engagement, employee happiness, experience, how people feel, right? And those are all really still relevant. They will always be relevant and are really important. I do think, though, that while we spend so much time focusing on those important things, businesses do need to remember, and HR leaders, business leaders need to remember, that all of those other things, payroll, recruiting, onboarding, compensation and rewards, total rewards, including benefits, perks, etc., all of those things help to drive the same mission and goals that all of those other things work to drive. Employee engagement is driven by decreasing burnout, increasing perks, benefits, rewards, right? All of those things. And I know I'm missing things, but I'm just kind of generally speaking here. That improves employee engagement. However, payroll, compensation, job leveling, transparency, communications, processes, operations, those also drive employee engagement. And you can't really do one without the other. If you are only focusing on the perks, benefits, rewards, and all of the fun stuff, but the actual day-to-day operations are challenging to a point where they're also not being solved. Like, you can have challenging operations, but if there's like a neglect for solving some of those problems, or a lack of interest in solving some of those problems, then actually you're going to have the same conundrum that you had before. And so I think what this article is looking to really like point out and say is that you can't just focus on the things that drive fun in the workplace, which again are really important. You have to also focus on the basics, because those basics have a huge impact on existing employees, highly tenured employees, and new employees. So everyone across the board. And honestly, I think that some of these conversations are happening because of what's going on at Twitter. Now, I don't know if all of you were expecting for me to talk about this, but I think if you've been listening to the podcast, you already know what I think. So I'll share what I think in a moment. I won't leave you on a cliffhanger there. But I do think that Elon Musk's relationship with his former and current employees at Twitter, from what we know, because of course we only have one side of the story and the other sides that we're reading on LinkedIn or from former employees. But really, I think that these discussions are coming out of this because it is the antithesis to everything that has been driven in the last 2 years from companies and what's been talked about from like HR and business thought leaders. So here's my thought on Twitter. I want to preface by saying that I heard an interesting explanation from someone not in HR who said, and this is a friend of mine, who said, it's not that I agree or disagree, but I'm just pointing out that private equity firms do what Elon Musk is doing all the time. And man, that made me think because private equity firms will come in, they'll acquire businesses, and they will just lay off people and rebuild the business. And this friend of mine was like, the only difference between Elon Musk and a private equity firm is that Elon Musk is tearing down Twitter and rebuilding it before it broke, or before it kind of like was down on the downhill side of its, of its experience, because businesses, of course, have this ultra climb up, and sometimes they do fail or they go through ups and downs. And so this friend of mine who is in business was basically saying that, before hitting that downhill, Elon Musk came in, forced a downhill to build it up, which when you think of it on a very generalized level like that, it's quite interesting. However, this is what I said to my friend. That's all fine and dandy, but there is a way to do things. Private equity firms, I would imagine, are not going into businesses and doing things potentially or allegedly illegally, from what we know. I'm sure that it happens because illegal things happen all the time. And I mentioned this illegality because there are grumblings of alleged illegal termination or wrongful termination processes from Elon Musk and Twitter to former Twitter employees who were part of this like mass layoff. I don't know specifically, and I actually haven't really found a ton of information giving a lot of specifics, but rather what these terminated employees are saying happened and what Elon Musk and his team are fighting against. Now, I'm sure that there is truth somewhere in there. So my perspective is that it is totally fine to buy a business and change it up. You don't even have to buy a business. You can change your business whenever you want. At the end of the day, the people who built that business, the people who are keeping it running, are human beings. And I hold people to a very high standard when they are responsible for people. And it doesn't matter if you have one employee or if you are a CEO of a company. And when I say one employee, I mean like if you're a manager and not an owner or a founder or a CEO of a company. We all have the same expectation to elevate people's experience, to send them back out into the world better than we found them, and to create a good experience and to treat people kindly and with respect and fairly every single day. And from the outside looking in, I'm not totally sure that that's what's happening at Twitter. And there's a lot of discussion around all of the things that are happening there, including revoking the remote work option, which you also know where I stand on that. I think it's totally ridiculous. People need to have ultimate flexibility in their lives. And if people want to work remotely, they should be able to. So I think that we will continue to see Twitter and Elon Musk in the headlines. And I think as a result, we'll continue to see thought leaders, journalists, business leaders start to talk about the implications and also how this shifts things in the other direction. Like a pendulum is always swinging, right? So during COVID and in the year after COVID, or if we're even after COVID, but like let's say 2022, we saw the pendulum swing very firmly in the direction of employee needs and demands, and that is who was in the driver's seat. And it's probable that the pendulum will swing back toward the employer. But there are more employees than there are employers. I'm going to go ahead and deduce. I do not know that for a fact, but I'm going to go ahead and say that is probably the case. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But let's assume that there are more employees than there are employers. It's going to be very hard for that pendulum to swing so far over back into the employer bucket, because if every single person had the reaction to their business as Elon Musk did and said, nope, we're revoking everything, mass layoffs without notice or minimal notice, etc., then there's going to be a huge upheaval on the employee side in the employee population. So it's just not realistic. And there are employers who do not think or act that way. So of course there's always going to be a middle ground. But I think this kind of brings us back to this original point, which is like getting back to basics. How would you, if you were Elon Musk's HR partner, how would you respond? What would you do to help him and whatever other team helping make these decisions? Because rarely is it just one person making a decision, but how would you influence an understanding? It's not to say that you're influencing a change, but rather, how are you helping to create an understanding based on fact with what is, the sentiment in Twitter, right? Because I think based on what we're seeing, it's safe to say that most Twitter employees are not aligned, or were not aligned. And there are many former Twitter employees who are outspoken about this. So it's our responsibility as HR partners and practitioners to not only focus on the things that, we are responsible for, like the basics as this article referenced, and all of the other things that kind of fall in between the basics and the advanced of HR professionalism and strategy. But we also have a responsibility to help enlighten and inform and educate other business leaders into trends and data and facts. So while most of you are probably not ever going to work with Elon Musk or someone akin to Elon Musk, you never know. There could be someone on a smaller scale who thinks and acts the way that he is, and it'll be an interesting experience for any of us to then, be able to educate, inform, and influence. And I think my parting thought here is that we're in an interesting position at the end of 2022 to be able to look back on the last couple of years and see the impact that we've had holistically. Again, looking at the big picture. It's also our responsibility to be able to analyze and communicate this impact through facts and data. And we can do that. But I think while we approach this new year, it'll be equally as important to think about, okay, how do we take all of that influence and all of that impact and look at the next frontier for what we need to improve? Is it going back to the basics? Is it elevating strategy? Is it expanding a team? Because I think I said this in the beginning, HR tends to run lean and mean. And I don't think that's an appropriate answer either. Like, how can any department operate and elevate operations if there isn't growth in headcount? So you'll want to really think about, especially if you're a decision maker on the business side, on the HR side, you'll really want to think about how you put into specifics and facts and evidence-based information why this impact could be greater with more individuals and how your impact has influenced employee experience from the basics and the elevation of the fun and the rewards and the benefits and things like that. So I'm going to close there. And hopefully I didn't leave you feeling like you're in an existential crisis. But I think that every end of year always poses these questions, and it's up to us to answer them. So I really appreciate you being here. Next week's episode will be the last episode of the year. Woo! Winter break follows. And so I hope that you rate, review, subscribe, keep tuning in. Make sure you're following the podcast so that in January, when the first episode launches, you will get a notification and you can meet me right back here next week and then the first week of January following that. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a wonderful week and I will see you next week.